every survey now we ask a few topical questions, a few thematic questions. And this time we were talking about regen ag. It was a very important topic coming into December, something that a lot of companies were talking about in very different ways. And we had, a lot of research and a lot of work being done on the consumer side to understand how consumers think and behave around that topic. But we are interested in understanding how the decision makers in the ag industry also think about this, right? They have a very unique perspective, and we were trying to capture that a little bit. So we asked 5 questions to our survey respondents to try to gauge a little bit of what's going on. The first one is just asking, how familiar are you with the term regen ag? And not surprisingly, at least to me, 82% said that they're at least somewhat familiar with the term, going all the way up to extremely familiar with 70%. Is still a large part of the respondents. And I don't know about you, Alan, but that feels to me, that makes sense. It's something that we were expecting. Those people are actually out there. They're part of the value chain. They have been looking and thinking about it, specifically farmers. They're thinking about regen ag for a long time. They might not be using that terminology, but once they tell people, hey, what discover crop or whatever that you're doing is regen ag, they're like, oh no, I'm familiar with it. I've been doing this for 50 years or whatever. Do you see that the same way?
Yeah, I guess the result that's really struck me was I was a little surprised, to be honest, that there was more than a third of them that only considered themselves moderately familiar with this, given the big push and all the talk over the last 2 to 3 years of regenerative agriculture and climate smart agriculture and sustainability, which has been in discussion for even longer than that. That I was a little surprised to see that we got a full third of the group that only considers themselves moderately familiar. We've got others in there that are slightly familiar or not familiar at all. I guess you'll always get some who aren't following those sorts of things, maybe, but I would have expected maybe to see even more familiarity than we have here, where they say moderately familiar. And I suspect what that means is moderately familiar is likely a reflection that the term is not well defined and it means
Mhm.
different things to different people. And so if you're asking me, do I know exactly what regenerative agriculture is, then I'm only going to pick moderately familiar as opposed to very familiar or extremely familiar, because I'm still kind of waiting on exactly what is the definition of regenerative agriculture. So I suspect that's what that reflects. But
Mhm.
boy, to see as much conversation as we've had in the industry about this term, you would have maybe thought a lot more people would say, I'm very familiar with it.
Well, and one thing that I discussed to one expert in this space, and they were telling me basically the more you know, you don't know. So the ones that have been doing this for a long time, they realize, like for instance, there's no one single definition. They're like, well, there might be so many things involved into Regen Act that I'm familiar, but I know there are spaces that I don't fully grasp. Uh, so maybe that's why you don't have that scale going further up in our graph. But I still say 82% of respondents saying, we're at least somewhat familiar. That is a very important result, because it signals to everyone around this industry, but within it, that we know what we're talking about, at least somewhat. So, from that question, actually, we try to build on that and say, all right, if you're familiar with it to any level, how would you describe Regina in your own words? So it was an open-ended question, and 3 words stood out: soil, health, and practices. Soil being the first one, practices the second, and health the third. That signals to me that soil health and the practices that drive soil health are top of mind for our industry, where things like emissions, in other words, that they didn't show up, or they didn't show up as high. So there seems to be a very clear understanding that Regen Ag, for industry experts or participants, it's around Regen Ag and the practices that drive it.
Yeah, I was a little surprised we didn't see more around carbon credits. That's a lot of what drives the industry in this space right now, and we didn't see nearly as much around that. The other thing I thought was surprising here was that I didn't see a lot. You're going to show in a different question here in a minute. I didn't see a lot here around income enhancement, revenue improvements, opportunities to get paid. That you would have thought there'd be some more economic side to this. This was answered fairly agronomically in the sense that, well, it's all about soil health. That's essentially what it says, the practices we adopt to improve soil health, conservation, farming, that sort of stuff. So I was a little surprised to see how much it was production oriented and didn't have nearly as much economic pieces to it. Something maybe worth digging into further in
Hmm.
terms of why we don't think about this as an economic opportunity. Um, Maybe it's hard to figure out how to get payments or get paid for doing these sorts of things. Maybe what that reflects.
Yeah, and that's a good point because we have a question that digs a little bit into that coming up. So the next question we asked, it's just overall support to Regen Ag and Regen Ag production. And not surprisingly, here we had less than 2% of people saying that they're against Regen Ag, uh, which is, I mean, again, not surprising, but we had about a third, a little under a third of people that are neutral. They're not against, but not pro Regen Ag. And I think, talking to people in this industry, it can be, the financial piece. I think that's a big component of that response, saying, yeah, it seems to be okay, seems to be good for the soil, therefore good for the farm, but I might not be 100% pro Regen Ag just because we might have a financial problem making that work for me as a farmer, especially specifically farmer, but other parts of the value chain might be following that perception as well. Do you see that in the same way, Alan? Do you have a different take?
Yeah, I think the result here was one that indicates, something around challenges you sometimes have with surveys. There's a social bias here where you're just not going to answer somewhat oppose or strongly oppose because that's not the perceived right answer. So when you think about it from that perspective, you really say neutral, somewhat support, and strongly support are the only three answers that were viable answers to be answering. And now that things makes you think, there's it's a pretty even distribution essentially between this is something that's really important to the way I think about what's going on in agriculture to those who are like, it's not that important. That's sort of the way I read it because neutral is essentially in this question, this isn't that important. So it's kind of interesting to me to think about it from that perspective that you didn't see um, more in that sort of strongly support area. So my take, Lorval, on this one is let's wait and see. Maybe this is going to be a big deal. Maybe it's not a big deal. I think we still got a fair amount of the industry suggesting that we're doing our thing, and if
Mm-hmm.
this regen ag thing takes off, okay. But we're not leading it. That's sort of that's sort of how I read this. I don't want to sound too pessimistic. That sounds a little pessimistic. I don't mean that, but I think that it is, you can read this survey and say, well, it's really positive because everybody's supportive. But if you understand the nature of surveys and the biases that can be there, this is a social bias question in a sense that you're just not going to get many people that are going to do the opposed side. That makes that sort of neutral and somewhat support stand out a lot more, I think, in terms of the insights here. People are maybe still a bit skeptical.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting take, and I think when you compare that to consumer behavior, it's somewhat similar. Although we see a lot more of the ends of the spectrum showing up, where you see a lot more people just coming out and say I strongly support, but you do see a lot more of the tail end showing up, the somewhat oppose or strongly oppose for whatever reason. But you do see a little bit more of that showing when you talk to consumers about that. So that's an interesting thing to see. Okay, so we mentioned this before. We asked um, professionals in the ag industry about what are the attributes they find important related to regen ag. So we alluded to that in the other questions we were talking about, but here we asked them to rank from 1 to 7, where 1 is the most important and 7 is the least important, those 7 attributes. And the results are very interesting. So maintaining profitability for the farmer was number 1, very close to enhancing soil health, which statistically actually they're the same. So those are the most important things when professionals in the ag industry look at regen ag. That's the first thing that come to mind. And then you have sort of this other group which talks about reducing water use, increasing crop yield, preserving biodiversity, and maintaining affordable fruit prices that are kind of close to each other. And then you have a very dead last attribute, which is reducing greenhouse emissions. So going back to what we were talking before, Alan, it seems to me that at least on the professional's perception, when we talk about carbon credits and things like that, they don't make the mental connection to regen ag. What they do make is the soil health part. What is interesting on that piece, though, is when we asked them to describe what regen ag meant to them, the financial piece didn't come up, although it was the very first attribute in this question. Really interesting way to sort of try to uncover how people think about this.
Yeah, it is shocking to me that we didn't do that when you sort of just asked an open-ended question, profitability didn't come up. But when we prompt them, right, because this is a prompting question, profitability was one of the choices, and that it's sort of like oh well, yeah, we need to make sure the farmer's profitable in this. It's fascinating to me that I wonder how much of the market really is thinking about farmer profitability when they're doing this, because when we ask them open-endedly, they weren't thinking about it. But then when we prompt them, it's sort of like, oh yeah, well that would be the first most important thing. The other thing that really stuck out to me about this one, my understanding has been, scope 3 emissions is a lot of what drives interest of the industry and getting to regenerative agricultural practices at the farm level, and yet reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which is essentially the scope 3, scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, but the scope 3 is the driver of why you want to get to more regenerative ag practices, and it's ranked dead last. That's just I was surprised by that, and I know we haven't done. I know you're going to be doing some of that analysis, trying to break this down a little bit. Be interesting to see whether the food side or food manufacturing side, sort of that downstream side, if that's the group, if that group ranks these differently than the upstream side of our survey respondents, because I was pretty surprised to see that would be ranked dead last in this process. So it suggests to me that our industry has not made a connection between, or it doesn't seem as though we've made a connection between regenerative ag practices and scope 3 emissions as being connected. And that's a bit puzzling to me as to why that's the case.
And for me, I look at the very first option, maintaining profitability for farmers, which is, I mean, if you think about it, it makes total sense. But again, they didn't talk about that. But also, it reminds us that whatever farmers are doing on their farms, they need to understand, and the ag value chain seems to acknowledge that it has to make sense financially, and might not be something that we're seeing in Regen Ag currently, given that wasn't mentioned when you ask people just to describe with their own words. So I think, as people within this industry that are trying to work with each other, we got to keep that in mind. And especially for policymakers, that perception really matters, because what is the message that's going to resonate with constituents in our industry? Certainly the profitability does, and the greenhouse gas seems to not resonate. And our very last question, and this is a hard one, and very interesting when you compare who's answering, but we asked farmers, professionals in the ag food industry, who do you think should be footing the bill for Regen Ag practices or adoption? We understand that Regen Ag has a cost, at minimum is a change in behavior that has a cost of change, but in a lot of cases it demands investments in machinery, and demands investment in people, knowledge, all sorts of things. And when we asked farmers, ag food professionals, the vast majority said consumers should be paying the bill. Basically, they're looking at a market-driven change. If there's someone willing to pay for it, if there's people willing to buy those products, the industry is going to provide them. Second, farmers, And then very interesting, our third option, 15% of respondents said all groups or everyone in the value chain should be food independent, including consumers. That wasn't a choice we gave them. We gave a choice of other, and please describe the other. And that choice was by far the most that showed up in the other category. So we separated them into a standalone option. And the very last one was the government, just showing the message that our professionals in the ag food industry don't see the government as the one that should be driving regen ag adoption, at least financially. So it's and just a quick note on that one. We asked a very similar question, exactly the same question to consumers, just a couple months before that survey, and the answers were flipped. Basically, they're saying the government should be the one paying for it, and the consumers should be the least group to pay for it. So really interesting dynamic here, and a very loud result, especially when you compare to consumer responses.
Yeah, I do think there was some interesting things around the fact that consumers see this in exactly the opposite way. The other thing that I find striking here, yeah, consumers is the one that comes out on top by a considerable amount. It's only a third of the entire. Think about this. This is an industry representative group. Only a third of them think the consumer should pay.
That's an interesting way to put it.
And really, if you think about it, 18% for farmers, 14% for food companies, 12% for government, 21% in that, or what, 24% in that other group, with a lot of that being, no, that's 21% in that other group, with a lot of that being all the groups, really suggests that what they're suggesting is that all the groups should pay, which actually, from an industry perspective, makes sense. Hey, this is a supply chain driven behavioral change, and everybody in that supply chain system is going to end up paying some portion of this. That's paying for some portion of those costs. That to me is sort of a logical conclusion from the industry. But if everybody in the supply chain is paying some portion of this, by definition, in the end, the consumer ends up paying, right? Because the costs are going to be higher, assuming that costs are maintained at a higher level over time. And they may not be, right? There may be that regenerative ag practices actually lower food prices at some point in the future. We generally don't think that's the case, but it could be the case that I suppose that would happen. So yeah, consumers they think should pay, or they think they will pay in the end, because not that they should pay, but because over time costs will increase, and because of that everybody's paying because costs have increased. That's how I interpret this result.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a very interesting result, and certainly something we need to dig a little bit deeper in and try to understand if there's sort of any one but me mentality going on here. So when you ask, a food manufacturer, they'll say, well, farmers should pay or consumers should pay, and then you go ask farmers will say, well, no, actually, food companies should pay, and I shouldn't be paying. So it'd be interesting to dig a little bit deeper into this question and see if